Hi everyone, welcome back to another reflective practice session. Today's session will look at, look at my journey, how I got to where I got to, and hopefully, I'm going to answer some questions in this session, but I'll also be looking at some of the questions that I got from students last year when I did a similar presentation. I'll start from the beginning. I remember when I first sort of got into architecture, I really liked things like this. So this is one of my favorite architects was Daniel Libeskind at the time. And I loved the geometry of the buildings, how everything was so dynamic, how everything kind of looked like it had a direction. It felt like a very strong set of lines coming together to create a space. And it's almost very sculptural in its form. As you can see in this building, you got this, still not sure what that is, sort of jutting out into quite an aggressive shape. But again, there was something really beautiful about that for me in terms of sculpture. And I actually, later on in sort of my architectural experience, I was lucky enough to visit Daniel Libeskind building actually, and actually more than once. So really beautiful buildings. I have nothing, except really good things to say. It's just a really beautiful experience to see them. But as I sort of got into architecture and as I was doing more thinking, especially in my sixth form years, as I was beginning to think about, where do I want to go to university and doing the application process, I met Sally at an event as part of the architecture center, which is now called Design West. I was part of the Shape My City program. And, at the time I was doing an extra year because I didn't get into my university choice in the first time around. So I had to do an extra year. And in that year, I kind of learned a lot about like what I wanted to do. And he gave me the opportunity to do projects like this, which was a kind of a community project, which Sally and I will do a separate talk about later on in the term. But this really changed my perspective on what architecture is and what it can do. And it was more about, it taught me that you can do more with architecture than create beautiful forms. There's nothing wrong with creating those beautiful forms, but it just taught me that actually so much more possible. And so at the end of that year, I got to meet a lot of people, a lot of amazing people who do a lot of amazing things. I kind of had a whole other world opened up to me about what it is possible to do. And we managed to build this beautiful project. And, I realized that, like I said, architecture doesn't have to be about four walls, sort of beautiful glazed facade and everything being meticulous and perfect. Actually, architecture can bring people together. And so that was a really big turning point for me, thinking about actually how can I go beyond what the building means? Like, how can I do something to help empower people? And when I went to university, as a result of kind of that experience, I started to think a lot more about what I wanted to do in terms of how with my architectural skill set. So I kind of stopped seeing architecture as a thing, as an end goal, but rather as a tool to help me do other things. And this is kind of a really big important shift for me, and I'll kind of explain a little bit more as I go along where that took me. But I spent a long time thinking about how you can facilitate positive social change, and the idea is, for a while I was thinking about looking at sort of disaster response architecture, but actually that didn't last very long because I sort of realized if you design something right the first time around, you won't need to have to keep going back and fixing it, and that is not just about like making a building sturdy, but it's also about making a building able to be adaptable, more useful for the communities locally as well. So it became much more about than just the building. Like I was saying, it became the architecture itself became a way to get to something else, as a way to work towards something else. So I spent a little bit of time in my first year, in the summer of my first year. I was in Uganda. I was doing some construction type work just in a school, and I took this book with me. It's this book. I would very easily say this book changed my perspective on things and changed my perspective on even my own career trajectory. So this book is called Freakonomics. As you can tell, it's a pretty famous book. I'm sure at least some of you have heard about it. And this book gave me the idea that actually, to be able to understand the bigger picture, sometimes you have to zoom out. And so this is kind of when I started to zoom out of architecture. And like I said, stopped seeing architecture as a final product, but as a skill set that you can use to reach your own conclusions, your own goals. So yeah, this started that process of turning stones over and trying to find all sorts of niches and things, and it broadened my worldview in a way that meant I was trying to find, you know, things that just interested me with no sense of coherence or no direct correlation to architecture. I mean, this book has nothing to do with architecture, you know, but it's an incredibly fascinating book that looks at social patterns and social trends and tries to understand, you know, it's two economists, well, an economist and a writer, who try to understand or explain social events, but at the same time, you know, they use an economic skill analysis skill set. I'm doing a very bad job of describing it, but it's a great book that I would recommend. This is the first of two books that I would say kind of really helped me understand my own journey. And so as I kind of started to think about this thing, I found actually a lot of my interests were coming into the work that I was doing at uni. And I also found myself just becoming this person who was like interested in everything. So in my 3 years of university, you can see kind of like I got up to quite a lot. So I'll try to give a very general overview without dwelling on this too much. You know, in the top right corner, my friend and I, we set up the architecture school's first debating union, which is still going to this day, and it tried to push people to think a little bit more about the sort of the real world in quotes, but thinking about, you know, what happens to architecture and your own understanding of architecture once you go outside of the education, once you go outside of this kind of cradle of education. And you know, we had a lot of really interesting debates, and the idea across all of these things that I did was I tried to keep bringing in different things into my own education and into my own experiences. As you can see in the top left corner, you know, the year that I was vice chair, I was elected vice chair to the Student Society, which is, I think, to this day still one of the biggest student societies, academic student societies in universities, but the biggest in the UK. It doesn't matter, you know. As a result of our kind of program, our committee won Best Academic Society for that year. Top bottom right corner, I was also involved in like Model United Nations. I had an interest in politics, I still kind of do. These kind of things kind of again came into my understanding, and then in the bottom left corner, my interest in sort of global development and sort of looking at a much larger scale of like how do cities change, how do people understand and navigate those changes, and trying to understand the theories behind that started to creep in. So I spent a lot of time sort of hanging around the corridors of the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. So I interviewed one of the professors there who was a former architect and talked about things like what happens when cities grow really quickly, and what is the architecture of the people who are doing it without architects. You know, what does that mean? Sort of an architecture of necessity, but without the awareness of architecture, or architecture without a capital A, as some might call it as well. So again, a sort of an eclectic mix of things that really kept me engaged and active with the community, with sort of the other things that fed into my architecture. And you know, my projects also, like I said, when I was at university, a lot of projects that I was doing, they weren't just like design a building. I was designing systems and frameworks to help feed into that. And that was just my own curiosity driving that, and that's something I always will try to encourage people to do, and I encourage you all to do as well. So I graduated. Gosh, it seems like such a long time ago. Yes, I graduated, and when I graduated, actually, was I got, you know, I sort of had that moment of thinking, do I want to carry on with this? Do I, you know, because as you know, it's 7 years. I wasn't really sure what I was doing. So in the summer, I sort of a few friends and I came together, and we had this project where we kind of put together a pavilion and a conference, which was a really good experience. It was the first time any of us like had built something in a public, and we had a whole program of events around it. And the whole project looked at like what it means to navigate the city and how different perspectives kind of formulate your own understanding and your experience of the city. And yeah, it was an incredible experience to put that all together, and also to listen to some really incredible conversations and ideas about different aspects of things like transport and mobility and how that influences people's understanding of space. How perspectives from the Middle East are influenced, or how people from kind of LGBTQ communities in the Middle East navigate the city as people who are very aware of the visibility. And there's a lot of really interesting things about age as well, and how loneliness is a big factor and a big issue in a lot of urban centers across the world. Lots of really interesting conversations. I can answer any questions anyone might have about any of them. But this project was a really interesting one because, again, it kind of was this process of trying to bring in all these interests together into this one space that kind of sits at the intersection of architecture, economics, development, urbanism. And again, that's something I hope has been kind of quite evident in some of the videos I've been giving you. I'll move along. So when I finished that project over the summer, after I graduated, I got lucky enough that I ended up doing my part one McRae and Lavington in Rotterdam. So I was, and even when I was over there, you know, for that whole year and a bit, I spent a lot of time actually looking at different scales. I was looking at things like master plans, looking at sort of strategic site development areas, really like, again, different scale, looking at like how to negotiate the changing needs of a city like London, but also kind of still provide the baseline need of we need homes. So this project was a really interesting one where we tried to balance the kind of the need for industry scale, industry large and small mid-scale industry plots, alongside a very tricky site, which is like one of the most congested or most heavily trafficked parts of London, Staples Corner, if anyone is familiar. And it was a really interesting project, and I did lots of projects like this, again, kind of slowly inching away from architecture, but still thinking about things in a very architectural way, like you can see here, like a section to be able to explain what we would do. And yeah, anyway, I'll move on. And then after that, I came back to the UK. I think it was around 2019, maybe end of 2019, start of 2020. I found myself working at Karen Christovich Carson Architects here in London, and kind of continuing that process of working within an architectural context, but actually not doing a huge amount of designing of buildings, but rather kind of understanding systems, working with communities, trying to help them sort of navigate these changes. And one of my favorite projects that I worked on while I was over there is Selby Urban Village, which is a project at a very complicated site, trying to understand how do we, provide. So there's a center in it's like a former school that was becoming it was very well used by local businesses. It was almost like an incubation space for people who needed somewhere to start their business or run a nursery, or a lot of local schools or ESOL classes. But the site was becoming redeveloped, and we had to come in as both architects and community engagement consultants to help manage that and try to understand what does the community want and what will they want from a new space, what works about this space. So again, it's sort of wearing an architecture hat but not actually doing architecture. And again, really valuable skill. And then towards the end of 2020, obviously during the pandemic, I was sort of drifting along doing whatever I could. And then the start of 2020, end of 2020, I found myself at the LSE. Actually, that's where I am today. I've just finished my master's, and I ended up going to study urbanization and development. So I think it kind of tracks, as you can see, in the journey that I've started to look at the increasing scales of sort of change in urban theories and development, and how things happen and how people adapt to those. So I spent a year and a bit at the LSE, and I've just kind of handed in my dissertation about 3-4 weeks ago. And it was an incredible experience to be able to kind of be in an environment where so many people are thinking about very similar things, but because of my background and my understanding of architecture, I can actually try to tie them in together in a way that makes sense spatially. A lot of time people find themselves stuck in theory. Anyway, I'll move on. Any questions about this, I'm more than happy to answer them. Yeah, I think even coming out of this point now, I still don't know where I'm going to go next. And that's one thing I want to emphasize. I haven't known where I wanted to go next since I was at university, really, the first one. So I think that there's nothing wrong with that. And I would really encourage people, those of you who are not sure, to explore as much as you can, both through the context of your own education, but also just in the decisions that you make about where you go next and what you do with your experiences. So yeah, that kind of, that's where I'm at. But before I kind of shoot off, I also want to give a shout out to the second book, which is called Range. And this kind of, I read this book very recently. It's an incredible book. And it's really helped me better understand some of the processes that I have in my own head, but also it made me feel like, whoa, actually what I'm doing is not unusual, sort of going over here and over there. I would really encourage any of you who are sort of feeling like you don't really know what you want to do to read this. It's a great book that looks at like generalists. And I think architects inherently are generalists, by the way. And again, I can get into that more in the discussion bit if anyone has any questions about it. But I think that being a generalist gives you a special sort of ability to be able to pull things together in ways that a lot of people can't. And I feel like, having read that, I was like, someone was almost describing my sort of journey since I kind of went to university. And that's kind of what I've been doing. And then it's an incredible experience to be able to read something and be like, oh my God, this feels very close to home. But yeah, I would thoroughly encourage any of you to read this, not just if you think you're a generalist, but it really helps you think about whether or not is it worth focusing on something so early, or do I want to do that? And if it's not, it also gives you a different perspective on things. So that's the second book that I would recommend in this sort of video. And yeah, again, final thing on where I am now. So I'm at the Quality of Life Foundation, and the work that I'm doing looks at I'm working as a research and engagement assistant at the Quality of Life Foundation. So I'm doing quite a lot of work with communities, talking to people, trying to understand what makes the quality of their lives better, or what it means for them in their own context, and then hopefully going to help. In the long run, the idea is to build enough of these case studies and these bits of research to be able to actually influence change, social change, provides change in housing provision culture in the UK, and improve sort of the quality of houses that are arriving in the UK in the long term. So it sits at this interesting intersection of kind of architecture, growth, urban growth, health and well-being, but also policy. And that's kind of where I am at today. So before I wrap up, I think one of the things that I wanted to do is give you a couple of tips and things that I think are really important. Again, I've kind of been peppering them in across this, but I think that, it's really important to make sure that you make the most of the environment that you're in. I think especially in this context of being a foundation year, you have the ability to pull in from so many different places, and you can even use that as an opportunity to find out things about what you like by experimenting with them in the context of, drawing in things like for example, if you're a skateboarder, why don't you, if you want to find out more about skateboarding, if you like skateboarding, you can bring that into the work that you do in your first projects or some of the projects that you do. It's not a great example, but I think the point is that, don't be afraid to pull in things that you like and are interesting to you into the work, because it becomes very evident in the kind of work that you put out. Right, on to some questions. So these are two questions that were asked last year. So the first question was, now that I'm working, well, again, last year, but now that you're working in the architecture industry, did you have any expectations as a student going to the industry, and were these expectations met? Are there any differences that you weren't aware of? I think the answer I gave last year was, there's a huge difference in sort of work culture. Again, it depends on where you go, but when I was a student, I'd come home, I'd have studio all day, and I'd come home and I'd work on my studio design projects, and then I'd stay up late, carry on working. But actually, what happens when you get a job? Hopefully, when you all get these kind of good jobs, that you go home and you realize you have the evening off because you finished working for the day. So it changes your relationship to work, but it also means that you realize how much time you actually had to spend. But in terms of going into the industry, I think it's always again, depends on where you go, but it's generally a very nice transition. People who you're working with have already been through that process, so they're generally very accommodating and very patient with you. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. Second, yeah. So I wrote about this when I graduated. I wrote for the RIBA about my experience, and I can share this link if anyone's interested. But it kind of says more of the same that I was saying about changing in how your relationship to your kind of spare time goes. Second question. How much of the philosophical rhetoric or debate takes place in the workplace, i.e. the ideas that we've been discussing in our reflective practice sessions? Who gets to be involved in these bigger picture discussions if they take place? Another good question, and I think with this one, it's really actually what I kind of said last year, and I kind of still stick by it, is that these conversations that you have in studio, outside of studio, actually influence where you end up going, rather than it's kind of the other way around, right? So the kind of conversations that you have about the role of the architect, about the philosophy of design that you have, about the role of lighting, materials, textures, all of these things will eventually influence where you end up getting into kind of practice. And so what I find is actually people who engage with these philosophical or rhetoric debates tend to have a better understanding of where they want to go, and they tend to find like-minded people in those practices, in those places, because of the fact that a lot of these practices actually are very clear about what they do and what they about what they do. So it doesn't really happen very often in the workplace, but this is one of the reasons. Again, this is the debating society that I set up with my friend, and this is one of the last events that we ran when I was there. Looking at these wider conversations is really important, because a lot of people kind of became aware of the fact that, especially in that debate, we talked about the role of the architect versus the developer, and whether the architect and the developer are actually forces for good in sort of urban transformation, or forces for evil. thinking about dispossession, gentrification, all these things that could become as part of the regeneration process. So, you know, a lot of people who were interested in these conversations ended up having to think about actually what kind of architecture or what kind of architecture or design or city making process did they want to contribute to? Did they want to take part in this process of designing really nice, beautiful luxury apartments that come at the cost of, you know, potentially pushing people out of their areas that they've lived in and have kind of built these community connections? Or do they want to kind of do something else, you know, that work specifically with communities on smaller projects to help kind of sustain communities or help kind of provide a very important need to communities? Two different paths, and both of them, I would say, you know, it depends on what you're looking for, and having these conversations helps you understand that and formulate that. So that's my spiel. I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to receiving any questions from you guys. Let me know, because I'd love to hear about where you're all at and what kind of thoughts and what kind of ideas you've had, and sort of what thoughts have come to you since started the program. And I know kind of we're almost halfway through the program. So yeah, take care everyone, and I'll see you I guess I'll see you in like 2 minutes, but I'll see you later this week. All right, take care everyone. Bye.